When HOA members ripped 12-year-old Caleb's backpack from his hands and tossed his insulin into the street, he collapsed in seizures just minutes later. Becky and Gerald Hunt didn't call for help. Instead, they filmed it and posted it online with a mocking caption. But Caleb's father, Brian, turned that moment of cruelty into a fight that would change everything. And wait until you hear how this shocking story twisted, and why in the end, justice finally struck back. It was one of those rushed Monday mornings that always felt like a race against time. Brian James stood by the kitchen counter, sipping lukewarm coffee as he adjusted the knot in his tie with one hand and scrolled through his emails with the other. He was already late for work. Again. Upstairs, his 12-year-old son, Caleb, was zipping up his hoodie, ready for school. The boy was small for his age, with quiet eyes and a calmness that always felt older than him. Living with type 1 diabetes had forced him to grow up faster than most kids. There was no margin for error with his condition. Caleb came downstairs, checking the contents of his backpack one last time. Insulin? Check. Glucose tablets? Check. Dexcom sensor? Still beeping regularly. He looked up at his dad, holding the bag tight. "Everything's good," he said with a soft smile. Brian ruffled his son's hair and gave a half smile in return. "All right, buddy, let's roll." But the moment Brian opened the front door, everything stopped. Standing in their neatly trimmed driveway were two figures that made his stomach clench. Becky Hunt and her husband, Gerald, the self-proclaimed watchdogs of the neighborhood HOA. They stood stiffly, dressed like they were headed to Sunday brunch instead of what looked like an ambush. Becky's hair was sprayed into place like a helmet, and Gerald's shirt was ironed to military precision. In Becky's hands was a beige HOA folder, thick with papers. Gerald clutched a plastic trash bag full of unidentifiable items. Brian barely had time to greet them when Becky's eyes dropped to Caleb's backpack. "What's that?" she asked, pointing with one manicured nail. "Medication?" Brian stepped slightly in front of Caleb. "That's his insulin," he said, voice firm. "He has diabetes." Becky's lips pursed. "We're aware. In fact, we received several complaints last Friday. Your son left his backpack unattended near the community mailbox for, 5 minutes? That's a violation of HOA safety protocols." "It had his emergency supplies," Brian said, eyes narrowing. "He went to help another kid who dropped their bike. He didn't abandon it. He stepped away for a moment." "Doesn't matter," Gerald cut in. His voice was low and oily, with a condescending smile tugging at his lips. "The rules are the rules. Medications should not be left in public areas. It creates liability." Brian took a breath, trying to keep calm. "You don't get to touch his medical equipment." But it was too late. In one sudden motion, Gerald lunged forward. Caleb instinctively stepped back, but Gerald was faster. He yanked the backpack from the boy's hands like a schoolyard bully, unzipped it with unnecessary force, and pulled out a zippered pouch labeled Insulin Emergency. "Here," he said coldly, and hurled the pouch straight into the street. It landed with a sickening thud on the concrete, rolling to a stop near the curb. Brian froze. Caleb screamed. "You want your medicine? Keep it in your house," Gerald added, smirking. The world seemed to stutter in that moment. Caleb stood frozen for half a second, then staggered toward the curb, but his steps faltered. His hand went to his chest. He was breathing fast, too fast. His knees buckled. "Caleb!" Brian dropped to his son just as the boy collapsed, trembling. His skin went pale. His lips began to turn a soft blue. Becky took one step back, blinking in surprise. But instead of reaching for a phone to call 911, she slowly pulled her own cell out of her purse and turned on the camera. Brian's voice cracked as he shouted, "Call an ambulance!" But Becky just stood there, recording. Caleb's eyes fluttered. His limbs jerked. His chest heaved for air that wouldn't come. Brian cradled him, panic rising in his throat like bile. He was shaking, not just from fear, but from fury. His boy was dying, and these people, these petty, self-righteous monsters, had caused it. And they were filming it. 4 minutes. That's how long it took for the ambulance to arrive. 4 minutes of hell. The ambulance took less than 7 minutes to arrive, but to Brian, it might as well have been an eternity. He sat on the cold pavement, cradling Caleb's head in his lap, whispering frantic pleas into his ear between choked breaths. The boy's chest rose and fell in short, panicked bursts. His fingers curled and jerked involuntarily, his legs twitching in unpredictable spasms. It was the kind of seizure Brian had only read about in worst-case scenarios, the kind he'd feared since the diagnosis, but prayed he'd never have to witness. "Just breathe, baby. Just hang on," Brian kept saying, over and over, the words collapsing into themselves with every sob he tried to suppress. His tie was soaked with sweat and tears, his hands shaking so violently he could barely uncap the emergency glucagon he always carried. But Caleb's jaw was clenched too tight, and his throat too swollen for anything to work. His lips were almost purple now. He needed a hospital. He needed help. And help was crawling through traffic, somewhere out there, too far away to stop the minutes from becoming a nightmare. When the sirens finally wailed into earshot, neighbors peeked from behind their windows. A few came out onto their lawns, murmuring and pointing. Not one of them stepped forward to help. Maybe they were frozen. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they just didn't want to get involved. Paramedics rushed in, 2 men and a woman, moving fast, practiced, focused. They pushed through the gathered crowd like a wave, taking over instantly. One of them dropped to Caleb's side, checking his pulse and pupils. Another snapped open an oxygen tank, while the third tore open the med kit. Brian stumbled backward, heart racing, mind screaming. His hands were covered in sweat and dirt. His knees were raw. He watched as they worked with quiet precision, speaking in clipped codes. But Caleb's body had gone still, limp. His eyelids fluttered, then stayed shut. He didn't respond to the light, didn't flinch when they inserted the IV. "He's unresponsive," one of the medics said. "Let's go now." Brian followed the ambulance to the hospital, speeding behind them like a man possessed. He ran every red light, ignoring every horn. By the time they reached the ER, his mind had gone blank. Time didn't move. It stretched and distorted, trapping him in one long, pulsing moment of dread. They wheeled Caleb into the trauma room. Brian wasn't allowed inside, so he sat. He paced. He pressed his back to the beige wall outside the ICU and clenched his fists so tight his fingernails left deep crescent moons in his palms. The only thing louder than the hospital machines was the silence between updates. 2 hours later, Leslie arrived. She had just finished a 12-hour night shift in labor and delivery and hadn't even changed out of her scrubs. Her eyes found Brian across the hallway, and the moment she saw the empty chair beside him, she knew. She didn't ask anything. She just ran to him and folded into his arms, breaking into tears that came from something deeper than fear, something darker. Helplessness, rage, guilt. Because while she'd been helping bring life into the world that night, her own son had almost lost his. "I wasn't there," she whispered. Brian shook his head. None of us were, and they didn't care. They sat like that for a while in silence, in limbo, until a nurse stepped out and said Caleb was stable, breathing, still unconscious, but stabilized. That was the word, stabilized. Not safe, not out of danger, just not dying, for now. Brian didn't sleep that night, neither did Leslie. They stayed in the hospital hallway watching monitors blink and nurses move. Their son lay behind glass, attached to wires and machines, because 2 people in their neighborhood decided to make a point. The next morning, as sunlight crept through the narrow window, Brian's phone buzzed. A neighbor had sent him a screenshot. It was Becky Hunt's Facebook post. She'd uploaded the video, the same one she recorded while Caleb convulsed on the ground. In it, you could hear Brian screaming, sirens wailing in the distance, Caleb gasping. Her caption read, "Another HOA drama queen trying to pull the sympathy card. Follow the rules next time." He stared at the screen for a long time. Then, without a word, he handed it to Leslie. She read it once, then twice. And for the first time in 12 hours, Brian saw something new in her eyes. Not grief, not fear, fire. On the 3rd day, the machines began to quiet. The endless stream of alarms and status beeps dulled into steady rhythm. A nurse entered Caleb's room around 6:42 a.m., gently adjusted the IV line, and paused when she saw his fingers twitch. Brian was already by his bedside, his eyes sore from lack of sleep. He hadn't moved much since they brought Caleb out of critical care. Leslie had gone home for a few hours, forced by nurses who insisted she eat, shower, and rest. Brian stayed. He couldn't look away from his son. Not now, not yet. "Caleb," the nurse said softly, watching the boy's eyes shift under his lids. "Can you hear me?" A beat passed, then another, and then, slowly, painfully, Caleb's eyes fluttered open, just a crack, just enough to find the light. Brian sat forward, breath caught in his chest. Caleb blinked, tried to move his head, but even that effort made him wince. "Hey," Brian whispered, barely able to form words. "You're okay. You're here. You're safe now." Caleb swallowed hard. His throat was raw, his voice almost non-existent, but he managed to push out a sentence, every syllable stitched with exhaustion. "Dad, I thought I was going to die," Brian broke. He didn't sob, not the way he had in the ER. He didn't punch the wall or scream. He just let out one long breath like something inside him finally tore loose. He reached for his son's hand and squeezed it like a lifeline. "You didn't," he whispered. "You stayed." But something changed in Brian that morning. Something sharp, cold, and precise settled in his chest. The helplessness was gone, burned out by his son's voice, by those 5 words that no child should ever have to say. By noon, he was on the phone, calling lawyers, dozens of them. Some were polite but dismissive. Others didn't return his call at all. But one voice cut through the static, like steel. "Send me everything," said Arlo Miller-Herr. "Now." Arlo was a former district attorney turned private counsel, known for taking high-profile civil rights cases against school boards, police departments, and local governments. He didn't blink when Brian described what happened, didn't interrupt when he told him about the video, the seizure, the silence from the HOA board. And when he was done, Arlo spoke just 2 words: "This qualifies." He called back 3 hours later after reviewing the medical records and HOA bylaws Brian had forwarded. His tone was sharper now, clipped, urgent. "This is not a civil nuisance case," he said. "This is obstruction of medical access, reckless endangerment, possibly even attempted manslaughter. You said he seized within minutes of the insulin being taken?" 4, Brian replied. 4 minutes. Arlo exhaled slowly. "Then we're filing criminal." But just as Brian felt that glimmer of momentum, of something resembling justice, another wave hit. A new test result. A new doctor, younger, quieter, more hesitant than the last. He walked into Caleb's room with a chart in one hand and his words measured like glass. "We ran an EEG and MRI last night," he said gently. "There's indication of short-term cerebral hypoxia." Brian stared at him. "Lack of oxygen," the doctor clarified. "We can't be sure of long-term effects yet, but based on what we're seeing, it's possible Caleb may experience residual issues, memory lapses, attention difficulties, or even future seizures." Leslie was back by then. She didn't speak. She just sat down in the nearest chair and covered her face with both hands. "What does that mean for his school, his future?" Brian asked. The doctor didn't answer right away. "We'll need time, monitoring, rehabilitation. It may be mild, it may not." That evening, Brian sat in the hospital cafeteria, untouched coffee in front of him, phone clutched like a weapon. This wasn't about HOA violations anymore, not about rules, not about property values, not about politics. Someone had made a choice, a deliberate, conscious decision to take away a sick child's medication, to treat his life like an inconvenience. And now, that child might carry the consequences for the rest of his life. Brian leaned forward, elbows on the table, and whispered into the phone as Arlo picked up. "We're going to war." The courtroom smelled like old varnish and dusted disappointment, the kind of place where lives were dissected in quiet voices and rearranged in verdicts that echoed for years. It had taken 4 long weeks to reach this day, 4 weeks of silence from the HOA board, 4 weeks of interviews, of depositions, of endless paperwork, 4 weeks where Caleb was learning how to hold a pencil again without trembling. And now it all came down to this room. Becky Hunt entered like she owned it. She wore an ivory pantsuit so crisp it could cut paper. Her makeup was perfect, not subtle, perfect. Lipstick sharp, foundation flawless. She looked more ready for brunch at the country club than a criminal trial. She smiled at a reporter near the door, a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Gerald followed behind her, silent as a ghost. He kept his head down, his suit dark, his expression unreadable. If he felt shame, it was buried too deep to show. Brian and Leslie sat in the front row of the gallery, dressed in black, not for symbolism, just for resolve. They didn't want to show emotion, not yet. They were here for truth, not vengeance. Caleb wasn't present. Doctors said the stress might trigger another seizure. He was home with a nurse, watching cartoons, unaware that the people who nearly killed him were now only feet away from justice. The prosecution started methodically. No theatrics, just facts. The date, the time, the action. Then came the video, the one Becky had proudly uploaded to Facebook, thinking it proved her point. Instead, it played like a confession. The courtroom dimmed. The screen flickered to life. There was the driveway, the early morning light, Caleb's backpack being ripped from his hands, Gerald tearing it open, the small black insulin case in his fist, the throw, the impact. And then, Caleb's scream. High, panicked, piercing. You could hear Brian yelling. You could hear Caleb gasping. And underneath it all, faint but unmistakable, Becky's voice. She laughed, a short, dry laugh, like it was all a show, a game. The jury watched in silence. A few shifted in their seats. One older woman on the back row pressed her lips together and blinked hard. Then came the medical reports. A neurologist testified that Caleb had suffered transient cerebral hypoxia, oxygen deprivation to the brain, which, in a child, could have lifelong consequences. Difficulty concentrating, cognitive decline, even the potential for future neurological disorders. The ER physician detailed the timing, matching the seizure precisely to the moment the insulin had been taken and thrown away. A paramedic confirmed Caleb was unresponsive on arrival, and then came the documents. Arlo Miller, Brian's attorney, presented a series of internal HOA emails and meeting notes. In them, Becky had referred to the James family as habitual complainers and rule manipulators. One note in her handwriting read, "If they want to challenge the board, let's see how they like living by the book. No more exceptions." Another email from Gerald, 2 days before the incident, said, "That kid's backpack is always by the mailbox. Next time I see it, I'm dealing with it myself." The defense had little to offer. They claimed concern for safety. They called it a misunderstanding. They tried to say Gerald didn't realize the insulin was vital, that Becky was just nervous and laughs when stressed. But the jury wasn't buying it. 3 hours into deliberation, the verdict came back. Gerald Hunt, guilty to attempted reckless endangerment of a minor, obstruction of emergency medical access, and criminal negligence causing bodily harm. Becky Hunt, guilty, necessary, criminal complicity, willful interference in medical treatment, and endangerment. The judge's voice was steady as he read the ruling, but there was a chill in the room. Not just from the words, but from the weight they carried. There would be sentencing later, but this moment, the declaration, was what Brian and Leslie had been holding their breath for. They didn't cheer, they didn't cry, they just held each other's hands and exhaled, for the first time in weeks, without feeling like the world was against them. Justice hadn't healed their son. It hadn't erased the trauma, but it had spoken. And in that courtroom, for the first time since Caleb collapsed, silence felt like victory. The James family returned home to something they didn't expect: applause. Literal, honest applause. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down were now standing in the cul-de-sac, clapping softly as Brian pulled the car into the driveway. Some held signs. "Justice for Caleb. We stand with the James family." Handmade, heartfelt, and maybe a little late, but real nonetheless. It wasn't a parade, but it was something. Word had spread fast. The verdict against Becky and Gerald Hunt had sent shockwaves through the HOA community, not just locally, but statewide. Within 2 weeks, the entire homeowners association that had once enforced arbitrary lawn regulations and threatened fines over mailboxes had been dissolved. The pressure from local media, the public, and even city council was too much to withstand. Their legal liability had become radioactive. In its place, a new neighborhood board was formed. Temporary at first, then voted in with overwhelming support. This time, the members were different, younger, more diverse, parents, caregivers, people who had seen what happens when bureaucracy loses its soul. The very first policy they passed was unofficially called Caleb's Law. It wasn't sweeping legislation, but it mattered. It required the HOA to maintain stocked medical kits in all public areas. It designated a neighborhood liaison for families of children with chronic conditions. It allowed parents to request emergency buttons be installed on public property for children with life-threatening diagnoses. And most importantly, it overturned the old regulation that banned storage of personal medical supplies in shared spaces. Portable medication shall be protected as a matter of human dignity, the policy read. Brian stood behind that wording. He helped write it. Caleb didn't quite understand all the details, but he knew something had changed. He knew the world outside his house felt safer than it used to, even if the scars hadn't fully healed. And when his school newspaper asked if he'd be willing to give a short interview, he said yes, without hesitation. The reporter was another 7th grader, a little nervous with her questions, holding a notepad like it might bite her. Caleb smiled through the whole thing, shy but steady. He wore a hoodie that said, "Still Standing," in bold white letters. When she asked if he had been scared, he nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I was scared. I couldn't breathe. But I kept thinking, my dad's coming. My dad's got me." Then he paused, glanced out the window at the playground, and added, "I didn't know I could be that strong." The article ran the next day with the headline, "More Than a Survivor, Caleb James Speaks Out." Teachers posted it on the bulletin board. Classmates left sticky notes on his locker that said things like, "You're brave," and "You saved more than yourself." For the first time in a long while, Caleb didn't feel different because of his diabetes. He felt proud. As for Becky and Gerald Hunt, they were gone. Not long after the verdict, a moving truck appeared in front of their house. No goodbyes, no farewell cookout. Just quiet boxes being stacked and a hastily taped "For Sale" sign swinging in the front yard. Rumors swirled that they were moving out of state, somewhere colder, somewhere quieter. No one really cared where they went. The lawn that Becky had once measured with a ruler turned brown. Weeds crept along the walkway. The porch light burned out and was never replaced. The silence from their empty windows felt like a kind of justice, one that didn't need applause or headlines. It was strange, Brian thought one morning, as he watered the grass near Caleb's favorite spot on the porch, how fast things could shift, how the people who had made themselves loudest had vanished into the quiet, and how the quiet ones, like Caleb, had become the strongest voices in the room. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through resilience, through truth, and through a boy who once couldn't breathe, but never stopped believing someone would help him stand again. Justice had been served, but peace never really followed. A month after the verdict, Caleb began waking up in the middle of the night, gasping, shaking, drenched in sweat. No screaming, no words, just fear. Deep, frozen fear. Brian and Leslie would find him sitting on the floor, arms wrapped around his knees, eyes wide and distant, like he wasn't all the way back from wherever his mind had gone. One night, he whispered what he'd dreamed. A man had grabbed his insulin and thrown it into the road. Again, just like that morning. Only this time, no one came. Leslie took him to see a therapist. The office was soft and warm, filled with calming blues and greens, but Caleb sat stiff and quiet through the first 2 sessions. On the third, they did a drawing exercise. Caleb drew a giant figure with HOA written on his chest, looming over a small boy holding nothing. When asked what scared him most, he finally said, "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid adults are meaner than monsters in comic books." That sentence broke something in Leslie, and it lit something in Brian. That night, Brian stared at the drawing for over an hour, not in anger, but in realization. Court rulings weren't enough. Laws weren't enough. If Caleb still lived with fear, then they hadn't finished what they started. The next morning, Brian called the County Department of Education. He proposed a program training HOA members in medical awareness, how to recognize diabetic emergencies, how to respond to asthma attacks, what not to do. Not abstract ideas, real guidance, built with input from doctors and parents. At first, the idea was politely shelved, too costly, too specific. But Brian didn't let go. He called again. He brought documents, news clips, medical reports. He told them about the hypoxia, the memory issues, the panic attacks. And then, finally, he brought Caleb's drawing. He laid it on the table in front of the district director. "This is what kids see when adults fail," he said quietly. The director looked at it for a long time, then nodded. "We'll start a pilot program." "That's all I need," Brian replied. It wouldn't undo what had happened. It wouldn't erase the night Caleb stopped breathing. But it was a start toward something better, toward a world where children wouldn't have to fear the people meant to protect them. Because real monsters don't live in comic books. They sit on HOA boards and smile as they tear away what keeps a child alive. Brian couldn't change the past, but he could make damn sure it never happened again. Caleb didn't ask to be a symbol, but he became one anyway. His story had already reached local news, but what mattered more was how it reached his school. After everything, the principal organized a voluntary assembly, a space for students to speak about health issues, invisible struggles, and fear. Caleb was the first to speak. He stood quietly in front of the gym, hands in his hoodie sleeves, and said, "I have type 1 diabetes. Someone threw away my insulin. I almost died, but I'm still here." There was a silence after his words. Then slowly, other voices followed. A boy from the 8th grade raised his hand. "I have epilepsy," he said. "I hide it because I don't want to be seen as weird." Then a girl stood. "I have a heart condition. I can't run in gym class, and I hate that everyone stares." More students shared. Some cried, some didn't speak at all, but nodded, quietly relieved. In a single hour, everything shifted. Kids stopped feeling like outcasts. They stopped carrying their fears alone. Because of Caleb, teachers noticed it. So did parents. The school counselor said she'd never seen so many students come forward for help, not out of crisis, but out of courage. At home, Brian watched his son grow stronger in ways he hadn't expected. Not physically, emotionally. Caleb was smiling more, laughing again, not always, but enough. And Brian, he started writing. Late at night, long after the house was quiet, he'd sit at the kitchen table with a notebook and just, write. He didn't plan it. The words just came. He wrote about fear and rage and the sound of sirens, about courtrooms and silence and guilt. But mostly, he wrote about Caleb, about the fight to protect one child and what it took to be heard. By the time summer came, he had a manuscript. He called it Insulin on the Asphalt. It wasn't just a title. It was an image burned into his mind. The vial, the street, the sun, and the panic. A moment where everything nearly ended, and what rose from it. He didn't write the book to be famous. He didn't even know if he'd publish it. He just needed to tell the story, because maybe someone else, somewhere, was living a quieter version of it. And maybe they needed to know. They weren't alone. They mattered. Their story mattered, just like Caleb's did. 1 year later, the James family sat down for dinner. No guests, no speeches, just the three of them, a quiet meal, and a memory too big to ignore. Caleb was in a good mood. He joked, he laughed, he asked for seconds. He looked healthy. He looked happy. And then, while pushing peas around his plate, he said it casually, like he'd been thinking it for a while. "I want to be a doctor." Brian looked up. "You do?" Caleb nodded. "I want to help kids like they help me." A beat passed. Then he looked at his father. "Thanks for not giving up." Brian didn't answer. He couldn't. He just nodded slowly, heart full. For the first time in months, he felt air in his lungs that didn't sting. They hadn't just survived the worst year of their lives. They had changed something. Not just in court, not just in policy, but in one boy with a backpack full of insulin and a future full of hope.